The grand marble pillars of the Supreme Court loomed high above, casting long shadows across the chamber floor as people filed in, taking their seats with quiet anticipation. The nation was watching. This wasn't just another hearing, it had become a high-stakes legal showdown between power and principle. Reporters and political insiders whispered from the gallery, their pens ready to record every exchange. At the center sat Chief Justice John Roberts, composed behind the elevated bench, fingers tented thoughtfully as his eyes swept the courtroom with the detached air of someone used to commanding the room. His gaze landed on Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a young, confident, and utterly unshaken. She stood poised behind the wooden podium, her tailored suit crisp, her expression calm, but her eyes burned with clarity. This wasn't unfamiliar territory. Though many saw her as a fiery new voice in Congress, they often forgot or ignored that she was a trained civil rights attorney with a courtroom history that demanded respect. Roberts tapped his pen once, twice, then addressed her in a voice designed to control the tempo. "Miss Crockett," he said smoothly, with a faint smile that barely touched his eyes, "I hope you're prepared to argue law today and not perform for the media. This court doesn't tolerate theatrics." A few chuckles rose from the press seats behind her. It was a subtle attempt to cast her as a showboater. Jasmine didn't flinch. Instead, she slowly turned her head toward the gallery and then back toward the bench, her voice calm, firm, and laced with precision. "Your Honor," she began, "the only people who think the truth sounds theatrical are the ones who fear the spotlight it brings." That line hit like a thunderclap. The room fell still. Even the court clerks paused their typing. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't leaned into dramatics. But with one sentence, she reclaimed the narrative and made it clear she was not here to play defense. She was here to argue fact, law, and justice. Roberts' smile faded slightly, his fingers twitching as he adjusted his robe. Jasmine opened the folder on the podium with deliberate grace, pulling out a tightly organized binder of case law, constitutional references, and factual evidence. Her voice didn't waver as she launched into her opening argument, weaving together history, precedent, and logic with the kind of clarity only a seasoned litigator possessed. By the time she finished her first 2 minutes, the room was no longer focused on Roberts. All eyes had shifted. Jasmine Crockett had just taken command of the Supreme Court chamber, not with arrogance, but with undeniable mastery of the law. And for the first time in a long time, John Roberts found himself leaning forward, not to intimidate but to listen. Chief Justice Roberts adjusted the papers in front of him, carefully masking his surprise. Jasmine Crockett had come out swinging, not with rhetoric, but with constitutional precision. Still, Roberts wasn't about to let her steal the tempo. Leaning forward slightly, his fingers laced under his chin, he spoke with measured authority, the kind that had made junior lawyers freeze on the spot. "Miss Crockett," he said coolly, "your position on federal overreach is a broken bar ambitious. Can you cite even one case where such an argument has held under full constitutional review? Or are we inventing new legal theories here today?" The room waited. A few murmurs trickled from the gallery. For many, this was the moment Jasmine would stumble. The Chief Justice's tone carried weight. Most attorneys, especially politicians, would backpedal, dance around the question, or fumble through unrelated citations. But not Jasmine. She didn't blink. Instead, she calmly flipped to a tab section in her binder, eyes locked on Roberts with the steadiness of a chess master who'd already seen 5 moves ahead. "Absolutely, Your Honor," she said without pause. Youngstown Sheet Tube Company v. Sawyer, 343 U.S. 579, 1952. In that ruling, this court explicitly limited executive power even during a national emergency when the president attempted to seize private steel mills without congressional approval. The majority opinion, authored by Justice Black, stated that the president's power must stem either from an act of Congress or the Constitution itself. Neither was present. Just like today, she placed the binder down softly, but the impact of her argument echoed loudly. There was a beat of silence. Roberts opened his mouth, then paused, He knew the case. Everyone in the room did. It wasn't obscure, but it was a bold choice, and she hadn't just referenced Ida, she weaponized it. The tension in the air thickened. One of the justices sitting to Robert's right raised an eyebrow, mildly impressed. Jasmine had done what very few had managed to do in this chamber. She flipped the question back on the questioner. She didn't just survive the cross-fury, she redirected it. Roberts composed himself, though the tightness in his jaw betrayed irritation. "Interesting interpretation," he said with forced neutrality. "But the context of Youngstown differs." Jasmine cut in, her tone respectful but firm. "It differs in circumstance, not in principle. In both cases, unchecked executive action operated outside statutory authority. If this court bends constitutional interpretation to fit political convenience, we risk not just precedent, but credibility." Her words hung in the air like a challenge. Not rude, not rebellious, just a broken bar, unshakably precise. She wasn't there to make headlines. She was making history, line by line, with the Constitution as her sword and shield. Roberts leaned back slightly in his chair, lips pressed in a thin line. For the first time, it was clear this wasn't the freshman congresswoman he expected to corner. This was a legal tactician, and she wasn't backing down. The atmosphere inside the courtroom was thick with tension. Roberts tried to regain control of the pace, shifting the argument away from precedent and toward procedural technicalities, where he believed she might falter. He adjusted his spectacles, flipping through a stack of papers with casual confidence as he posed his next move. "Even if we entertain your interpretation of federal overreach," he said, his voice steady, "your entire argument hinges on documentation this court has not officially admitted into the record. Until the authenticity of your claims is verified, Miss Crockett, this remains speculative." He sounded confident, almost dismissive. It was the classic judicial tactic to dismiss the argument by disqualifying the evidence. But Jasmine didn't react like someone caught off guard. Instead, she calmly reached into her folder and pulled out a slim, bound document sealed with a federal clearance stamp. "With all due respect, Chief Justice," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the chamber, "this memo was declassified last month following a congressional inquiry. It confirms in plain language that the agency in question acted beyond its authorized scope." Page 17 includes direct communication between department heads, referencing actions taken without statutory approval. If the court is committed to upholding the Constitution, then this document must be admitted, because without it, we are choosing blindness over justice. She stepped forward, offering a printed copy to the clerk. The gallery stirred again, reporters whispering, pens racing. Robert's eyes narrowed slightly as he glanced at the cover page now being distributed. It bore the official seal. It was real. "This court," Roberts said slowly, "decides what evidence is admissible." Jasmine's gaze didn't waver. She took a breath and answered, not with defiance, but with piercing precision. "And the Constitution decides what this court must protect. Due process is not optional. If evidence of unconstitutional conduct is withheld from the record, then we are not interpreting law, we are enabling injustice." The room fell into a heavy silence. Even the justices seated beside Roberts paused. They weren't looking at her like a politician anymore, they were listening to her like a peer. She had just done what few dared to do in front of the Chief Justice: challenge the integrity of the process, not to score points, but to defend principle. Roberts looked down at the document again. He knew he couldn't ignore it, not legally, not ethically. He taped his pen once against the desk. "The document will be reviewed under Rule 104. Proceed." It wasn't an admission of defeat, but it was the first real concession. Jasmine nodded and continued, her tone unwavering. She moved seamlessly into the next phase of her argument, quoting statutory limits and citing the Oversight Committee's findings. The courtroom was no longer a battleground. It was now a stage for something rare, a moment of pure legal brilliance. Jasmine wasn't trying to win votes or headlines. She was holding the Constitution up like a mirror, forcing everyone to look. And behind the bench, even Roberts, who'd begun the day expecting to outmaneuver her, was beginning to see it. She wasn't here just to argue. She was here to make law reckon with truth. As the final gavel echoed through the chamber, signaling the end of the hearing, the room remained unusually quiet. The usual chatter that followed major arguments was replaced with a thick, Thoughtful silence. Reporters who had come expecting a typical political stunt were stunned into stillness. Law clerks, judges, aides, everyone seemed caught in the same state of quiet reckoning. Jasmine Crockett stood at the podium for a second longer, collecting her documents with the same calm she carried in. Her fingers moved with intention, her expression unreadable, but there was a subtle pride in her eyes, earned, not flaunted. She had just walked through a legal minefield that even senior attorneys might have avoided, and she emerged not only unscathed but triumphant. Chief Justice John Roberts removed his glasses, resting them on the bench before him. He sat back in his chair, watching her as she prepared to leave the floor. His face remained composed, but something had shifted. His earlier attempts to unsettle her, to cast her as an overconfident upstart, had failed, not because she was loud, or rebellious, or dramatic, but because she was, quite simply, right. One of the associate justices leaned toward him and whispered under his breath, "She just rewrote the rhythm of this courtroom." "Who trained her?" Roberts responded without looking away. "No one," he muttered quietly. "She trained herself. And it shows." Jasmine began walking toward the exit. She didn't rush. She didn't glance around for applause. But as she passed the justice's bench, Roberts did something subtle, something powerful. He stood slightly and not fully, not ceremonially, but enough to be noticed. A quiet gesture of respect from the highest seat on the land to the woman who had just stood her ground in it. The cameras caught it. So did the nation. Social media would replay it. Analysts would try to interpret it. But to Jasmine Crockett, it meant only one thing: the law had spoken, and she had been heard. Outside the building, a crowd had already gathered. They weren't cheering a politician, they were applauding a lawyer, a woman who reminded the country what real representation looks like. As she stepped onto the steps, the sun hit her face, and for a brief moment, it felt like the air itself held still. She didn't wave. She didn't raise her fists. She simply looked forward, clutching her binder to her chest like a shield that had won the battle without shedding a drop of blood. Inside the chamber, Robert sat quietly at his desk. He glanced again at the memo Jasmine had entered into the record. Then he looked at the name on the docket, Crockett v. Federal Authority. A small smile flickered across his face, not of amusement, but of recognition. The game had changed, and Jasmine Crockett was no longer just a name in politics. She was now etched into the legal conscience of the country.